Welcome, everybody. My name is Rick. I'm your host for On the Hook, the official podcast of Yellow Pike Media. I'm joined today with some really great guests, and we're going to have an amazing conversation about brand storytelling. I'm really looking forward to this episode. It's not often I get to talk to so many people at once and listen and learn right along with the audience. So let's start with Keith Pape, our CEO here at YPM. Hi, Keith.
Hey, buddy. How you doing?
Doing well. We're also bringing in Mitch Cohen, our executive creative director. I never get his title right, but I think I did that time. Yes? Perfect. I'm never perfect. And we have a great guest today, Brian Newman. Brian, welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background, what you do.
Sure thing. My name is Brian Newman. I run a company called Subgenre. It's a small company of about 5 staff, and I work pretty much in helping brands with making films and series and other content, but mainly long-form film is my specialty. And my background is from the traditional film world. So I used to run a lot of film festivals and film organizations, including giving the Rockefeller Fellowships. I used to be CEO at the Tribeca Film Institute here in New York. And all of my work was more traditional independent films you would see at Sundance, Tribeca, South by Southwest. And I kind of fell into the brand space. A friend of mine had become CMO at Patagonia and asked me to help on a film. And the next thing I knew, that's all I do now is pretty much work with brands making films. So happy to dive in more to it, but that's the short background.
That sounds amazing. How did you get into, and you touched on it really quickly, what was the journey between merging those two very different, in my opinion, genres of long form filmmaking and brand storytelling, which I think most of us think of as 30, 60, 90-second snippets of content that tell the story of a brand, as opposed to long form, narrative content?
Yeah, and I think brand storytelling can be any of those things, and also podcasts and other media, all kinds of stuff. But there's a subset of brands, not all of them, that are really interested in telling different types of stories that kind of demand a longer format. Oftentimes it might be a complex issue or something tied to their values that you just can't do it justice in a shorter format. Or they might be wanting to reach audiences, especially even just a few years ago before Netflix started having commercials like they do now. There were streamers where, if you weren't making a good film that would show up on that streamer, you weren't going to show up in front of that audience. And so I think brands started looking at this space. I fell into it kind of weirdly because I just happened to have a friend who had become chief marketing officer at Patagonia, as I mentioned, and they had already decided to make a documentary. And they essentially called me up and said, we're making this film, but we don't know what the heck to do with it. Like, we don't want to just throw it on our YouTube channel. What do we do to make sure it gets seen? And I understood the traditional film world and distribution and could help them with that. And so that film was a film called Damnation, which came out about 7 or 8 years ago and was about a very obscure, complex issue to a lot of people, which is the idea of getting rid of dams, especially dams that are no longer producing energy, which every dam has a shelf life, so to speak. And, understanding like, why would you blow up a dam and restore natural salmon runs isn't something that the average person thinks of every day. So a feature-length documentary was a better way to tell that story. And that was quite successful, which I can go into more detail on in a minute. But essentially, we were able to distribute it globally in theaters, on Nat Geo, Netflix, multiple broadcasters globally. And it was so successful that a lot of other brands started calling me. And then it kind of shifted into not just distribution, but also helping them figure out the strategy for what they should be doing if they want to do film, so that they do it right, instead of making something that might win an award but no one sees. They're really focused on like, how do we make something that people will actually show up and watch, either in a theater or on Netflix or something like that.
And all of a sudden, your esoteric creative life was over, Brian, and the brands had their hooks in you. It was they never let go.
I still make some independent films, and I produce
In your
independent
free time?
narratives and documentaries in my free time. I'm in post on a narrative fiction film right now that has nothing to do with brands. I decided to keep the two worlds separate. So, and the reason I did that is really because I like to be able to go to brands and be able to help them find out what they should be doing that's best for them, but not be pitching like a script that's in my back pocket.
Right.
They can trust me better because I'm not going to just suddenly pitch something that's really what I want to do, not what they want to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe someday I'll have a film that would be a perfect fit for a brand client, and I would bring them that, but I haven't had that yet either. So it's usually very distinct projects.
Does the brand storytelling feed into opportunities to do, traditional filmmaking, or is it mostly the other way?
Like the Uncle Drew thing, where they did Uncle Drew, look for most people look like just a commercial film, yet
right.
it was
absolutely.
brand storytelling.
Yeah, and I think that it happens in a couple different ways. One is a lot of brands are more focused on documentary films because they are easier to align with their values, and they're not dealing with unions and agents and all that kind of stuff. But several brands are starting, like the Uncle Drew example, or super famous ones like Barbie, etc. But REI, the outdoor retailer, is one of our clients, and they really, in the course of working on strategy with them, they really wanted to not focus so much on the mountain climbing film that you would expect from an outdoor brand.
Right.
But more like, how do we get people just off their phones, off their butts, and outside? And how do we get people to think about the benefits of nature and being outdoors? And what we naturally started leaning towards was really good storytelling, narrative fiction films, maybe based in true stories, but often pure fiction, that happen to be good stories that will make you think about nature and outdoors in a new way.
Paolo and his team are absolutely incredible. I mean, those guys are. I mean, it feels like he's been really grinding at it, crawl, walk, run style for years, slowly figuring out how that works. And what I see, did they just win an Emmy, a Tony? I
don't think they've won the Emmy, but they've definitely had films that have won awards at different film festivals. And they actually, we did. I apologize. We won an Emmy.
I saw some picture. I saw a picture of him posing in front of it.
So sorry, I lost track there, because REI also doesn't only do full financing of films. They also will invest in films that come from other creators. And that project was one that was already being funded by another producer and a nonprofit grant giving organization, a foundation. And so I don't think of it as our movie, as an REI film.
So they're really starting to invest in trying to support others that have a similar coordinating mission to them. They're now also the finance arm of others that are trying to do good in that outdoor space.
Yeah, which doesn't work for every brand, but with REI, their
so
typical
natural to them.
Project, it's very natural, and what they want to do is be one of many in the funding group. So if that particular film that won the Emmy, we co-financed that with Niatero, which is a foundation that supports Indigenous and Native American filmmakers.
Right.
And that funded a series, and one of those episodes won an Emmy. They've also financed, alongside big Hollywood production financiers, a film that was just at the Toronto Film Festival just a few weeks ago called Fry Bread Facing Me, which is a narrative film that Taika Waititi executive produced.
Right.
And we're co-financing that. We're about 20% of the budget at REI, alongside 4 or 5 other, traditional film financiers like Macro, River Road, Participant, and some others. And so what's great there is REI has a division that Paolo runs called REI Co-op Studios. REI shows up as a production company in the front logos alongside the other producers, but there's no product placement.
Right.
It's more about the theme overlapping with REI. And then when the movie comes out to the public, in this case, the Fry Bread Facing Me one that premiered in Toronto, we can help market it, we can help promote it, help get butts in the seats at theaters, and hopefully eyeballs watching it on Netflix or some other streamer eventually. But it's not really about product placement or selling a product. It's more about the values that REI holds.
Doesn't that seem to be a trend? It seems like, Brian, I swear you and I were talking about this at Sundance this past year, about how there's more and more films being done in this area that have less and less product placement, but they're still brand content. I think of like Hillary over at Amazon, almost none of the things they were doing with like the farmers in Iowa and the different things, Amazon's almost, the climate pledge will be mentioned, but Amazon itself isn't mentioned. Palo stuff, it's almost never mentioned. It's like, it seems to be, it's the less is more is one of the lessons that brands seem to finally be learning, where it was like, it felt like it was so on the nose for a long time.
Yeah. And I think that's a learning curve for a lot of brands. It takes, some guts to tell your boss in particular, like, we're going to put a bunch of money in this and not have our brand show up. But then when you realize, like, okay, your goal at the end of the day is not just to get on Netflix or something, is actually to get onto a streamer or wherever and have an audience member not just watch it, but tell someone else they should watch it too.
Right.
And an audience member or consumer is going to be more likely to do that if it's a real movie that doesn't feel like an advertisement. And then maybe you're surprised at the end and you go, oh, wait a minute, this was actually funded by John Deere, or this was funded by REI, or this was funded by Climate Pledge. That's pretty cool. Why are they doing this? And you get intrigued and look into it. That ends up being more valuable than having your Coca-Cola show up in someone's hand or whatever.
It's like you've watched it, you've told 5 friends about it, and then 5 days later you hear this little whisper because you see a mention of it on the internet or something, that it was funded by one of these brands. It's like it almost sticks with you more because it's just such a surprise that nobody.
And it's also more genuine, and it's a way to get across those genuine values. And I think that I'd hazard to guess 99% of the brands doing this, they're still going to do advertising and they're still going to do product placement.
Sure,
REI does product placement as well in other shows, but it's different strategies,
right?
And if you're, most brands, you want to show up in as many places as possible, and the way you do that over time is not just advertising, but also these other things, including brand-funded films that are entertaining and interesting, but not about selling a jacket or selling a car the next day.
Right.
Yeah. First, I one day dreamed to forget that I won an Emmy as well. So, but the longer form the content is, the less you hit them over the head with what's going on, because it becomes so blatant and apparent. There's going to be entertainment on a short form 30-second bit. You only have so much time to get a message across.
Yeah.
In the long form thing, any story you tell in the long form, it's subtle and nuanced the way you tell a story, right? So people are going to turn off something right away. I don't think they care that brand message shows up sometimes, but like you're there, you're engaged for a long period of time. You want to be entertained and shown a story or told something. And the more you hit them over the head with your product placement or with brand messaging on the ball, is the less engaged they'll become. It just becomes very tiresome very quickly.
And I think we've seen like millennials and Gen Z really kind of back away from brands who don't share their values. And this feels like an opportunity for a brand to very quietly and subtly say, hey, this is what we support. And then as that audience picks that up, they kind of take that, hey, your values and my values align. I should look into your products.
Yeah. And that's something that has come out in a lot of research, is that younger audiences, millennials and below, are actually looking to brands to showcase their values and stand for something and align with those values. And for most brands, not all brands, but for most brands. And it's also true for employees. So one thing we've been finding a lot in the last couple of years is brands that are doing this also for employee recruitment and retention, because when they're going out trying to tell someone they should work at their company instead of another company, if they can point to this film and say, like, this shows our values, like we actually did this because we care about it, that's also a way to get employees and keep them as well, because they want to work somewhere that they care about.
Would you say within this space, budgeting tends to be more of an issue than say in like an independent film space where you're trying to make, that back pocket script that you were talking about? Do you feel that in the brand marketing side of this, if a brand is putting this down really kind of in their marketing budget, I would assume for a lot of this is where that falls through. Does that suggest that the budgets will be larger than a traditional independent film, which these feel like they're trying to be, or does it take on a different shape because the expectation of the returns and the messaging and who they're trying to reach are different?
Yeah, I think that it's safe to say that the majority of these budgets are a little bit stronger than your average independent. Independents are usually scraping by to raise the money, and a brand usually is spending more money making an advertisement. Just making the advertisement itself might cost a couple $1 million, and they spend another 10 or 20 or something on the marketing campaign to get the ad out there. And so a film that especially in a documentary that might be, $750,000 to $1.5–2 million, it seems pretty affordable for them. And so it's not as hard, but it's still not a minor cost. And so they need to justify internally to their colleagues why they're doing this. So there's usually a lot of not so much worry about the budget, but a lot of vetting at the early stages to really make sure that it's going to be a good marriage, so to speak, and that the film, and usually they want to give the filmmakers enough creative control that they can stand on the stage at a film festival and say, this is a real movie. The brand didn't, put their hands in the creative process. And if they're going to trust a filmmaker to do that, they want to make sure that they're on the same page at the beginning. And so there's just a lot of vetting at the beginning, but then less worry about having to make back the budget like as an equity investor would on an independent film.
Right.
There are exceptions. REI does operate as an equity investor on a lot of their projects, but most brands, it's coming out of their marketing budget. And if they get lucky, they make money, but that's not their goal.
How do you feel about brands, the ability for them to let go of creative? There's probably a lot of different stakeholders that they have very specific, lens of how they see the product and what their stake is in that. And there probably is more people involved a lot of times. How do you navigate those waters?
It can be really tough. I mean, I think that a lot of my job in the early stages in particular is getting them to understand that this isn't the advertisement where you're going to be showing up on set or zooming in to the shoot. You need to you need to trust the filmmaking process and give that creative control. So you pick good partners that you can trust, that have a track record. Even if they're an emerging director, they've got a producer or someone that knows what they're doing, and you can trust the team as a whole. And you need to trust that, a story doesn't get told by committee, and usually brands come along to that. It just takes a little bit of time. At the same time, where I've seen things go really bad is when filmmakers take that as a carte blanche to just walk away, make a film and show up at the end of 6 months later or a year later. Because if you haven't brought the brand team along for the journey, then all of a sudden the film just pops in their laps and they're like, oh, wait a minute, what is this? It's better to let them see, a treatment and then later on see rough cuts and brands, the people who work there often have good advice. So we'll usually work out deals where the brand can give notes, but the filmmaker has the option to take the notes or not. Unless it's something that's like a legal issue. Like, if you say this, it's going to get us sued. That's usually something they can say something about.
Right.
But that rarely happens. But where I have had a film that I was involved in kind of late in the process where the filmmakers really took it to heart that like, this is our baby and we can do whatever we want. And when they showed up literally at a movie theater to show the completed film to the brand reps, they were like, wait a minute, this wasn't what you told us you were going to make. And that didn't go so well.
Isn't that a John Cusack movie? I think John Cusack made that movie, and there was a Billy Crystal, and they played the movie right in front of everybody. I think it went really well. I remember that. That was great.
Doesn't work out that way. And also, when it comes time to distribute the film, and hopefully you're going to in the best case scenario, premiere at South by Southwest or Sundance or something and sell to Netflix or whatever the case may be. That's whatever your best case scenario is. But the other part of that equation is the brand will help market it, which means, the team that greenlit the film needs to convince the person who does Instagram to post about it, and the person who does Facebook to post about it, and the person who handles the catalog or the retail store to maybe put up a poster. All those people need to be convinced. And if they've never heard of it before, it's just harder to do that. But if they've been hearing like, oh, we've been making this movie for the last 6 months and we've heard this report that like shooting's going really well and they were able to attach this great executive producer as a narrator, and
it gets that excitement building over time. They want to be part of it. Yeah, no, absolutely.
So you got to think of it as a team effort, even if you are the creative control as a filmmaker at the end of the day. And then, the truth be told, I'd say 75% or so of the brands I work with are really good about staying hands off. And then there's a subset that are, they have a committee weigh in, but my job is usually to try to be that person who distills the notes from 5 people into something the filmmakers can understand.
Translate a little bit.
So it doesn't derail the process.
Mitch and I do that all the time. I feel like Mitch, Rick, and I, that's our entire job.
That's my week. Yeah.
Constantly
So
trying to distill especially us between creator influencers and brands, it's like it's a very different world. Sometimes they speak very different languages.
Totally. Well,
good.
And creators and influencers even more so. I mean, because they've got their voice and they've got to stay true to that. Right. Filmmakers do too, but it's a little bit less direct sometimes because they're kind of behind the camera.
Yeah, they have a style, but it's not necessarily a direct voice.
Yeah. That's actually a great segue into a thought I had. Do you find that there's a collision there between sometimes the talent you're choosing to use, whether it's traditional actors, actresses, or influencers, and the creative process within the filmmaking, itself? Is there a point where, agencies or talent have really kind of tried to press no, I think it should be this way point of view? And how do you negotiate that, especially, in something that is basically a brand marketing vehicle?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is the best way to avoid that is by, getting everything clear up front. And then, when my brand clients have worked on particularly narrative films with actors that have, powerful agents, from one of the big agencies behind them, we're usually at that stage stepping back enough that the producer is handling a lot of that relationship. And as long as we've kind of set the tone with the producer of like, these are the guardrails, these are the things that we can and can't do, and we let them negotiate those fields with the talent and hopefully keep the brand uninvolved in that part of the process. Where that ends up being more of a issue is a lot of times brands, instead of going to a producer or director directly, they'll just think, oh, I should call up Hollywood agency X and work with them to put together a project. And then the agency is kind of packaging the whole deal. And that oftentimes, there's a conflict between maybe what the agency wants to do with its clients versus what the brand wants to do. And so, I'm somewhat pushing my own business here, but that's why we try to get involved before that stage is to keep that from happening. We haven't had that happen too often. It's usually been more about making sure you've got the right fit between the production company and the lead producer and director with the brand than anything. And that's just a lot about like early vetting and getting to know each other and making sure that you've got the same vision for what the final project's going to be.
Yeah, those early communications make all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
Hey, one of the things I thought about when I knew we were going to get to catch up was from one of your articles the other day about film festivals. And I was thinking about how from like the days when you ran, the early 2000s when you were running Tribeca, and now, how much have the festivals changed, especially like post-COVID? Are the majority of films at the festivals brand funded? over the days when it was all indie filmmakers, or is it still mostly indie filmmakers in the festivals?
Yeah, it's still mostly indie and also Hollywood. I mean, so you'll go to Sundance or Tribeca and you'll see a Netflix original or an Apple original that was not independent, really. And then you'll have a mix of the independents that are looking for a home. But I would say that there's more brand funded films playing at film festivals now than 8 or 10 years ago, but they're not the majority. They're still in the minority. At any given festival, there's usually only 1 or 2 out of maybe 100 films that are brand funded, maybe 5, but usually under that number.
Yeah.
So it's still a minority.
So on the Netflix thing, are they doing it? Are they kind of setting up a trial balloon by releasing this non-indie at a film festival? Are they trying to see if it reacts well before they put it on their service? Or why do they do that?
No, they're usually doing it purely for buzz building, because if you go to one of the major film festivals, the press is there, and it's an easy way, when there's not a strike happening, it's an easy way to bring your stars there, get everyone in front of the press at the same time, do the press lounges, do all those things, and get a lot of long lead press done in advance. So, Rolling Stone or, whatever magazine can interview all the actors in one place, and then the article runs 6 months later. It's also, especially the major film festivals like Cannes, Toronto, Berlin, etc., those are a good place to position a film for Academy Awards consideration.
And do they become kind of the anchors? Do they almost help fund the film festivals by them being part of it, so that way the indies can be there? Or
it's one piece of it. It's partly funding, because like if you're the opening night at the not Sundance, but at New York Film Festival or another like Tribeca, there's usually a party afterwards that's funded by the studio who's presenting the opening film, and the money that's spent by them promoting the film is helping subsidize other films.
Sure,
but it's really not so. Sponsors are doing more of that subsidizing, and so it's that indirect thing. Like you're more likely to get Pepsi or whoever's a sponsor when you can point to, I've got this red carpet event.
Right. Netflix is showing something big, and
they're not as interested in my little independent film.
Yours might be better, but
they're still sponsoring the whole festival. Right. And same with press. So most film festivals wouldn't care about being the premier festival, except press cares about it, because press writes about like, oh, Tribeca or South by Southwest had this many premieres. And it's like a prestige factor to the press as much as anyone else. So it all kind of intertwines into the big films helping the small films in some ways. And then ideally, and this is kind of broken down in the last couple of years post-COVID in particular, I mean, we're not completely out of it, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It used to be that those same people coming from Netflix, Apple, et cetera, were also looking for independent films to potentially buy for their services. That part of the film festival world seems to have been dying off in the last 2 years. There's a lot less, there's a few exceptions, but there's a lot less of that kind of dream story from when I was back at Tribeca, where someone would premiere at Tribeca, sell their movie for $10 million that they maybe, made for $500,000. That's not happening as much anymore. A lot of the Netflixes and Hulus of the world are doing more originals, and they're either getting involved earlier or commissioning it themselves.
So the internet's allowing them to go direct, and they don't need the film festivals for that portion of the discovery process like they used to.
Yeah, and then also they're just looking for something different. So Netflix is trying to expand globally. Their goal is to get and keep subscribers, and a series with well-known actors that's true crime or sensational or whatever is going to bring in more of those than a little independent narrative. And so they're just buying less of those smaller films now. So there's actually kind of like a crisis in the independent film world right now, especially for documentaries, where there's films that are premiering at Sundance, winning awards, and not getting distribution at all. And people are trying to figure out what that means and how to address it. It's another reason why I'm staying in the brand funded world, because in the worst case scenario for a film funded by a brand, even if you don't get into Sundance, you get in maybe to Hamptons or Big Sky Documentary Festival or some kind of mid-tier festival, the brand usually has the marketing dollars to still take it out and make it a success, or to help make it a success with a distributor, whereas a little indie probably can't do that. And so I like the idea of having something that's festival proof,
Right.
and a brand can still make sure it gets out there.
When a brand takes on something at that caliber, that level, of that length, the equity that gained by the prestige of having a feature-length project on Netflix, what is the argument they use that, like, why not do a 15-minute thing we can put on YouTube where we have all the analytics of how good it did and where it went to and what it led to, versus maybe somebody asked somebody to watch this on Netflix and that happened and we can't really track how that worked. How do you make them comfortable with that aspect of putting that kind of money and investment and time behind doing something like that?
Well, so first off, that's the biggest problem in the field. You go to brand storytelling conference or anything like it, the topic of the day is measurement and how do we measure success. And as you probably know, and most people know just from reading the newspaper, like my parents who aren't even in the business know this, like Netflix doesn't really give out a lot of numbers and data, whereas you can go on YouTube and, as a consumer, see a lot of data. Plus on the back end, as a producer and brand, you can see a lot more. So that is a big debate for sure. And, but I think that brands that are doing this know that not every film that plays, films can play Netflix and get lost in the queue. So it's not always even your goal for a film. But there's also a notion that being part of a bigger streaming service, when it succeeds, can put you in the cultural conversation just in a different way. And, we used to have this debate when I was working a lot more with Patagonia in the past, where they had a film and they would just want to put it on their YouTube channel because they get a lot of views on their YouTube channel. They can guarantee they're going to get 1 million views for almost anything they post. But my point has always been, that's true, but that's your core customer that's already coming to your YouTube channel, or they've got fans that are recommending them to it pretty often. Going back to my mom as an example, my mom doesn't go to Patagonia's channel. She goes to iTunes or Apple TV, and she goes to Netflix and Hulu. And if it's not there, she's not going to see it. So ideally, what you would do is have a bit of both. You have maybe some short form content like REI does, for example. REI has 15-minute shorts that go on their YouTube channel, and then they have feature-length films that they're hoping will end up on Netflix or Apple or Disney or one of the others. And then they might do ancillary content that still is on their YouTube channel that talks about the film that's on Netflix, and it enables them to talk about it in a different way. So we might have, like when Kira Sedgwick's film Space Oddity came out, which REI was an investor in. Space Oddity is a fiction film about a young man going to Mars. But the reason you would go to Mars is because the Earth is being destroyed and we're looking for a new home planet. So it lets you talk about climate change in a different way.
Right.
So the film was a film that played in movie theaters, and it's now on Hulu. And REI only shows up in the logos in the front, not in the film whatsoever. And it's not on YouTube. But they do a podcast where they were able to interview Kira Sedgwick and Kevin Bacon and talk about the issues in the film. And they also have a video version of that goes on their YouTube channel. They can talk about it in their other existing YouTube videos and product videos, even like when they were shooting the movie, we outfitted the crew in REI clothing. That wasn't in the movie, but we had a product team shooting that, and that ends up on the YouTube channel. So you still get other content that exists alongside the film, plus you get the benefit of being in a place you wouldn't be able to get a brand film like Hulu as easily if it's not a good movie.
Right.
Are there tensions? I'm kind of backing up a little bit to the film festival conversation. And as I was listening to what you were saying, Brian, it sounded to me like there either is or could potentially be some real tension between, your traditional independent filmmaker and these sponsors coming in and these brand storytelling films coming in that are being paid for, by multi-million-dollar companies. Is there a fear of the true independent filmmaker getting lost?
Yeah, I think there's a fear of that for sure, and there's a tension there. And I think, having worked at film festivals in the past, the tensions most felt by the programmers, the curators of the festival. And so I think they set a little bit higher bar for brand funded films, and it's got to be really good so that they can feel like they can justify it making the cut. And then you'll also see at several film festivals where they actually separate. So they'll have maybe one or two brand films that are good enough that they just get in the program alongside other independent films and Netflix films and HBO films or whatever. And then they'll actually also have sidebar programming that's not part of the official program, but is like a film by a sponsor. And so it's clear to the public, like, this isn't part of our normal program. And it's like a separate event altogether. So, but that's because of the tension. I think the reality is, just right now, there's a dozen or so good brand funded films each year, but not enough to take over the marketplace.
Right.
That could change in the future. I think the other thing you're seeing, though, is because of the state of the independent marketplace, meaning that it's really bad right now for independent films. It's harder to sell them and get them to an audience. There's more filmmakers who are willing to work with brands because they're like, I need to do something that's going to make sure this gets seen. So if I can get, it used to be a little bit more of a feeling of purity, like I'm not going to do commercials, I'm not going to do brand funded work. And not every filmmaker, but a lot of filmmakers are saying, you know what, maybe I'm not going to work with a brand I don't like maybe I care about the environment, I don't want to work with Exxon, just, stereotypical example. But Patagonia or REI or John Deere, those are good companies. I don't mind working with them. And if they can help fund my film and then make sure people show up to watch it.
Right.
So you feel that tension is actually good, in that it kind of raises the bar for everyone and the expectations for everyone. Do you see a situation where there is a festival that is a brand funded festival, that we're only talking about brand funded, films, and it's not open to a traditional independent film?
We kind of have that in brand storytelling, the one that Brian and I go together, which it's like he said, it's part of Sundance, but it is a separate piece. Is that the only one you know of? Is brand storytelling the only one that does
brand
that?
Storytelling's the one that so the brand storytelling conference takes place in January alongside Sundance. It's not part of Sundance, it's a separate event, but they're officially sanctioned.
There you go. That's a fancy word right there.
And but when you play your film at brand storytelling, you're not allowed to say it premiered at Sundance. You have to say it premiered at brand storytelling. Okay. And it's an honoring of the best brand films of the past year. And so, probably 100 or 200 films submit, short form, long form, and they pick, I don't know, maybe a dozen that they end up showing at the conference. Tribeca also has a thing called Tribeca X Awards,
right,
which is a part of the Tribeca Film Festival, and they do show brand films and they give awards and have panels around brand films, but it's not open to the public. It's just for brand film people, like the brands, the production companies, the agencies. The general public doesn't really buy tickets to that. It's almost not even known to the general public. I could see, I don't know if it would be I don't know how many people would want to go to a film festival that's just brand films, because they might think it's just going to be, they're getting advertised to. Even if the films end up being good, the perception would be different. But I could see more sidebars of a film festival.
Like at South by. South by seems like that would make a lot of sense, since there's already a lot of industry and marketing people who go.
Yeah, and some of these brand films are even ones that are very on brand, so to speak. Like, we worked on a film years ago about the history of Levi's, and a different production company made it. We just helped on the distribution side. My company didn't make it. We just were distributing it. And it was a short film about the history of Levi's, but the history of Levi's is awesome. Like, it's really fascinating. Like, it overlaps with, so much things in our past, from rock and roll to skateboarding, like all kinds of different cultural phenomenons. And I think the average person would have paid to go see that film because they are just fascinated by the company. So I think if programmed smartly, it could be a good sidebar of a festival, and you could still have your independent and Hollywood films on the side, because festivals really aren't. So this is also another thing. When I used to run film festivals, I would always argue, like, we do have an obligation to show independent films and help promote those, but the festival is really about the audience and making the audience see new things. So that should be a mixture of new Hollywood films, classic films, restored films, maybe some brand films, a few Netflix films. It's about having an enjoyable experience for the audience they wouldn't normally see. And so I think it's about that mix, and hopefully independent is still part of that, but it's not the only part of that.
That makes sense.
You mentioned distribution, that sometimes your involvement with a film is strictly distribution. Are there unique challenges to each kind of film, a true independent film and a brand film? Are there certain avenues that are closed if it's a brand film, or open more easily because it's a brand film?
Yeah, the only avenue that's usually closed to brands, excuse me, with a brand film is PBS or public broadcasting internationally, so like Arte France in Germany, or Channel 4 in the UK, because those are publicly funded broadcasters whose mission is expressly not to be commercial, so they don't want to showcase brand funded films. There's some exceptions, like when you go to PBS, you'll see underwriting, but there's a much bigger editorial divide, almost like a newspaper, between editorial and sponsorship, and they keep that very clean in the public broadcasting world. If a brand funded film is good, every film festival and every distributor will show it or buy it. Like, we've had films premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, Sundance, Toronto. We've sold them to Apple, Disney, Netflix, Nat Geo. We've gotten them into movie theaters like Laemmle in LA and IFC Center in New York. There's the bar is a little bit higher in that the people who program those spaces and those venues are going to make sure, like, okay, does this pass the smell test, that it's not just an advertisement?
Right.
Whereas on the independent side, it's just, is it good? But they're not as worried about the rest of the ethics potentially. So it's a little bit higher bar, but not much higher, as long as it's good. That's the main bar. At the end of the day, if you're a movie theater programmer, a festival programmer, you care about, are people going to show up in the seats? And if you're programming for Netflix or Hulu, are they going to watch it or tell people to subscribe and watch it? And so it's really about the quality bar more than anything.
And do you think that nomenclature of what branded content is, and it's called branded content, like an influencer sometimes is a negative term, like The Last of Us, that's branded content, right? The show.
Yeah.
We call that branded content. It's purely about the brand, right? It's like,
no, he calls that branded content, right?
Yeah, but it is, right?
Yeah. So I think, and that's also something I'm trying to do in the film world, is not call it branded content. No one's come up with a great different name, but I tend to say like brand funded entertainment or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Differentiate it. In the best case, it's just a film that happens to be co-financed in some way by a brand. I think, but there is definitely that stigma. And so, like myself, when we're distributing a film funded by a brand, we don't submit to Brand Storytelling or Tribeca X or Cannes Lions or any of the brand specific things until the end of the campaign, because we want to position the movie as a movie. So I've even had films that the director submitted to Tribeca X, and then I withdrew from the consideration, because I was like, I don't want to be seen as a brand film only. I want to be seen as a movie.
Right.
And then later we can be celebrated as a brand film also, but we want the audience, the general consumer, to show up because they want to see the movie.
Yeah, you don't want that label on it too soon. Yeah.
And we even go so far as, like, we don't hide the branding, but ideally, the brand is one among several logos in the front of the movie along other production companies, not just the brand.
Right.
That's the best case scenario. For the most part, we've definitely done like Patagonia Presents, and Patagonia is a trusted enough brand that doesn't detract from it. Maybe if it was Burger King Presents, it might be different. Depends on how fun the movie is, I guess. Like, it depends.
Right, exactly.
As long as people are entertained and engaged, like, it doesn't matter where the film came from, what you shot it on, who's in it. Like, that's the core to anything to be, entertained or engaged by, that it resonates with you.
Yeah, a great film is a great film.
Yeah,
it's got to be a great film. But that's the key is, as you guys know, like, people make bad films with the best intentions, even when they're not a brand involved.
Right.
The brand, like finding the right team to make it with, trusting them, and really understanding that you want to tell usually a character-driven story that is going to be entertaining or informative, or some version of entertaining to the public, and that's not going to probably be like your employees, your scientist, your whatever on the screen. It's going to probably be something that's related to your company, but not about your company usually.
Right.
We keep talking about films specifically. Are there other formats where this kind of storytelling works? For example, could there be a 6-part episodic documentary that brands are interested in funding, or a series of films that tell maybe a longer story than a single film would?
Yeah, absolutely. And more brands, we've been saying film, but it's, I would say half of my work now is episodic series with brands. The difference is it's very hard to distribute a series that's a traditional length, like 30 to 60-minute long episodes. If it's not on a major streamer, like it's hard to get attention for those on YouTube or on your own channel. So you usually don't want to fully finance a 6-episode, hour-long each series as a brand and not have distribution lined up. So what typically happens is the brands are funding development, and we're going in and pitching the series to a Netflix, Hulu, et cetera, at an earlier stage, so that we know we have distribution lined up.
Do brands actually ask, what is the benefit of this format versus that format? Will I have better viewership? Will it impact my viewership? I mean, I think you were kind of hinting around sort of that kind of issue and needing to be a little bit more forward thinking for episodic content. But does the format impact viewership?
Yeah, absolutely, it does, but in different ways. So sometimes, like obviously, right now, consumers seem to be watching more series than feature-length films, except for like the big, Marvel movies, Barbie, etc., event movies like people are going to go to. But a lot of times, people are just really into watching good series, and it's been a golden age for those. And so I think that's what a lot of people are leaning towards. But not every story fits the episodic. There just might not be enough story there, and so oftentimes we'll sit down with a client when we're able to come in early, and we really talk about like, who's the audience you're trying to reach? What are the goals? What are you trying to accomplish through this? What do you want people to take away from it? And we decide the format based on those combination of goals and audience, and the type of story that fits for that. And sometimes we get surprised. Like we're actually doing a project right now with a brand that I can't name, but it started as they thought they wanted to make a feature-length documentary, and as we started making it, there were just so many stories to be told that it couldn't be told in a feature without just being all over the place. And so it's starting to shift into being an episodic series, and now we're kind of shifting gears, and we're starting to. It's not even done. It's still in post-production, but as we're shifting gears, we're starting to engage with the streamers before it's even done, because we want to find a home for it. But instead of like trying to premiere it at Sundance and then sell it, the idea is we would go direct to Netflix or Nat Geo or whoever it may be. In this case, it probably wouldn't be those particular players. It might be someone more like Max or someone. But it's just, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but it's definitely about thinking through like, what are your goals? Who's the audience you're trying to reach? And what's the best way to tell the story? It's also not always film or series or even short form. Sometimes we're like, that would be better as a podcast, or that would be better as a photo essay on your website or something. But
are you really doing that kind of thing? Are you recommending them occasionally away from video and saying, hey, this really is a good subject, but a podcast is better. This is great, but it should be it should be an essay,
Yeah. When I can, we do that.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes they don't
a lot of
that
times
option.
They're dead set on they want to make a certain thing. And that's one of the bonuses too, though, of a brand is if they're willing to commit not just the budget to make the film, but also towards the distribution component, like helping with the marketing and the what we call prints and advertising in the film business, then they can still distribute something even if it doesn't get picked up by A24 at a film fest. They can still do what we call a service deal, where they hire a company like mine to book it in theaters, get it onto iTunes, get it onto Amazon Prime. That can still be done as a brand with some money.
Oh, okay. So there are options then with the proper budget that they can fund their own distribution really without.
Yeah. But what we tend to advise people even more, Keith, is a bit more of a hybrid. So like REI is a good example again. REI has many podcasts and short films that are really, they stand alone as they are as a podcast or a short film, but we're actually using them as explorations of IP that might be developed into a film later.
Oh, that's awesome.
Started as a podcast and then see like how's it working with an audience?
Yeah.
What's resonating and not resonating.
Yeah, if they love the story or the characters or whatever it is.
Story does,
Yeah.
Maybe it's a different take on the same story becomes a film.
Yeah, you start looking at what the comments are, you look at what the feedback is, and it helps guide you before you jump both feet in.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
And the smart scenarios, and I haven't actually had this happen, but it would maybe even get lucky and go further. Like maybe it starts as a podcast, becomes a film, and then later someone makes a game or something. But we've only had to go from podcast or story, like a print story, to a film. We haven't had to go to a third iteration yet, but I hope that happens in the future.
Didn't True Detective start that way? Did True Detective start in another format and then end up being the Netflix show or HBO show, whatever it was?
I believe so.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Yeah, I think it was a podcast originally, wasn't it?
Yeah, I thought so. Sure. Well, occasionally I'm crazy and I'll get confused, like with Serial and the other ones, and it gets all mushed together.
Right.
And that's the other thing, is there's so much stuff out there. So
right.
Whatever you're doing, you've got to figure out like how do you do it the best way and break through the noise. So it's not as simple as saying like this should just be a podcast. It's also like if you're going to do a podcast, you got to do that right, and you got to do it with the right team, and you got to market it right, because you got to be able to break through the podcast noise. That's also hard.
They all have their challenges.
Yeah,
definitely. There seems to be a growing trend in traditional commercial, I guess, film and also especially now with episodic content, where you see, learn more about this episode, learn more about this, whatever the topic is, listen to our podcast about this episode. Yeah. Are there opportunities there, or are there examples you can give where that's working for branded storytelling as well?
Yeah, we're seeing that happen a lot, and I hate to keep on picking on REI, but that is where we've done it the most. Is we'll have an accompanying podcast that is like an interview with the director or with the subjects of the film, that tells you more about the project than just in the movie. So REI, there's multiple examples of this, but just one recently was a documentary called Canary, which is about a scientist who invented ice core sampling, where they take those big samples from ice and they can tell what's happened over geologic time. And he's like a legend in the climate field. And the film is playing, I think, 30 cities for a full theatrical run, and like another 300 one night only as a real movie release, and then it'll be on a streamer later this year. But then REI was able to do a podcast with the subjects of the film where they go more in depth on certain subjects that weren't covered in the film, because it's another way to bring attention to it. And then they can also do things like Patagonia has done, where they'll have a film coming out and then they'll have an essay that is related to the film in their catalog that is mailed to consumers, and you pick it up in the store. And so it's a way of getting the story in multiple places for consumers to experience it and hopefully push them back and forth to the other ones.
As we're getting a little bit close to our time here, I had two thoughts, and I was really curious. Do you see brand storytelling as, and this is probably a really bad way of putting this, as a potential source of brand rehab? So if you have a PR issue, is there a way, you mentioned ExxonMobil in the past. Yeah. Is there a way that, you can use brand storytelling to turn that public perception. I mean, it's probably the worst example I could have given you.
This is the lipstick on the pig auction right there.
Yeah,
That's a lot of lipstick.
So,
right?
First off, not only is it something that could be done, it is being done. And in the worst case scenario, people call it brand washing,
Right.
But oftentimes, if you look at the state of brand storytelling in the past year, there's at least one film that if you start to dig into it, you'll realize like, oh, that brand had a PR problem. They decided to make a movie to try to either tell their side of the story or, establish their bona fides in the climate space or whatever it may be, or to shift attention into something else.
Right.
So that's already happening in one regard. And in the second regard, people are thinking about, I can't name names, but we've got brand clients that have come to us and said, we're getting attacked in certain quarters because of our stance on subject X. We want to tell our version of it. How do we tell a story about this? And usually it's me connecting them with a filmmaker. It won't tell the story the brand wants to tell, but it'll end up being what helps them. Mm-hmm. But it's not going to be what the committee at the brand thought they wanted to tell.
Right, yeah, of course.
That's
almost always a bad idea.
Yeah.
They're going to be way too on the nose. You need to be a lot more creative about how you tell that.
But it's at the end of the day, and sometimes the brands it's nothing evil. Like they literally are being misunderstood and they want their side of the story to be told, and that's the best way to do it. And so I think it can be both, but there's definitely, I bet you there are going to be plenty of climate films funded by car companies that are still doing bad things, but they're trying to say we're doing good things too. Or whatever.
Right. Yeah, it happens.
So
absolutely. I'm curious. My final question is that we've kind of danced around, ROI and, cost benefit analysis kind of things, but what would you say are just overall generally the results and impacts of brand storytelling, both on brands and their bottom line, and also on just filmmakers and filmmaking in general? Is this a great relationship? Is this a relationship that has, a lot of potential pitfalls that have to be carefully navigated? In your opinion, where does that all kind of break out?
Yeah. So first, I think for brands, it's generally really beneficial as long as they are thinking about it the right way, which means it's about building the brand, as they say in the business, like top of funnel, getting people to care about the brand, know about the brand, care about your values. If you're looking at it to sell X number of products by a certain quarter, that's probably not going to work for the most part. It's going to be more about long-term value building in the brand, and brands have to do a bit of both. You need the product marketing, you need to sell, but you also need that long-term brand building. And that film that I mentioned that Patagonia brought me on, my very first brand film that I worked on, Damnation, people are still selling the hats from that film on eBay for up to $400 because they loved it so much.
Wow.
And so like that to me is like long-term brand building. Like they like I've rented canoes where the guy renting the canoe to me was like, saw my hat and was like, oh my God, do you know that film? I love that film. That film changed my life. And like, I'm like, yeah, I distributed that movie. And to this day that happens. And that's long-term brand building. So I think it's good for that. In terms of for the independent film, I think it long-term can be good. There are, like, I get calls every day from filmmakers saying, I've made this film about this subject. I think it would be great for brand X. And I have to say, sorry, I can't help you. Like the brand you're thinking of is already doing a different movie and they've already spent their budget. They're not looking to be pitched by a random independent filmmaker. So it's not going to be the panacea that solves all the problems of the independent film sector.
Right.
But I think it can be one avenue for filmmakers to explore for certain projects. It can also be a way to, you can do brand films and your passion projects, and brands can be one leg of the stool that helps sustain a career, because your independent film might take 5-6 years to come together and maybe make a profit. In the interim, maybe you don't want to make commercials, but you're okay doing something that's brand funded, but still a quality film. And that can be really valuable and can continue your career. And I think it can be great in that way. Like I would like to, one of my goals is to connect brands to filmmakers more directly to existing projects. It's just really hard to do because, brands just work on a different timetable usually than
Right.
filmmakers.
Brian, thank you so much for your time today. This is one of my favorite types of episodes where I get to listen more than I talk and learn things that I'm personally a fan of documentaries. So this for me was very fascinating. I'm sure it was absolutely fascinating for our audience. I think we all come away learning a lot today. Where can we find your work or projects? What's the easiest way for people to check that out?
It's really easy. My website's subgenre. It's sub-genre, sub-genre.com. And that's where you can find all my projects, clients, and I also have a newsletter that people can subscribe to for free there as well.
Excellent. What should we expect next from you? If you can say.
So I have a film that I produced called If You See Something, that's a story about an Iraqi American's experience in the U.S. post-September 11th. That's nothing to do with the brand. That'll be coming out sometime in the next year. And we have several brand films coming out, and they'll be announced on my website in the next few months.
Nice.
Awesome. Thank you again for your time. Mitch,
good to see you guys.
Keith, thoughts, final comments? What are you guys working on? What's your next project?
I didn't get to talk about half the things I wanted to talk about.
What do you want to talk about? Jared will give us 10 minutes.
We needed more people. We need more time.
Always.
You never get to see Brian often enough.
Awesome.
Brian, thanks for having me.
Hopefully we were Jared said 10 minutes granted. So Keith, whatever you want to do. Brian, thank you so much for coming. I hope we get to do this again. Maybe when your next project releases, we can convince you to come back if we didn't scare you off.
No, we'll come on with the filmmakers next time. We'll come talk a bit too.
That would be great. We're going to hold you to that.
We'll bring Ben or somebody on.
Yeah, absolutely.
That'd be great.
Great. Thanks,
awesome. Thanks everybody. Guys. Thank you for listening. As always, we'll be back again next month with a brand new topic and new guests. In the meantime, you can check out all of our past recordings on Spotify. Please sub. You can also check them out on our YouTube channel. And of course, as always, if you want to know more about Yellow Pike Media, you can go to yellowpikemedia.com. All the links will be in the podcast show description. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you next time.